Hey guys, what's up? It's Charlie here, and today we're going to be looking at 10 armies you won't believe exist. So there are 196 countries in the world today, and 171 of those countries has an army. But sometimes these armies can be broken down into really weird and specific units, or the whole army is just plain weird. And here are 10 really mind-blowing examples of this. But before we start, be sure to like the video and subscribe, and comment I subscribed and I'll try to reply. So coming in at number 10, we have Hot Army. So this army is coming from Russia, who are known for their big army of over 2 million people, but in the army over 200,000 of those people are women, and Russia is also known for their attractive women. So put the two together and you have Russia's Hot Army, which is also known as Vladimir Putin's miniskirt army. The girls are just like any other soldier, but they have to wear tight-fitting miniskirts and they always have to smile. But if you're in the Air Force of Russia's women army, then you have to wear a tight-fitting green one-piece suit. And while some people might be thinking this is awesome, a lot of people find this really sexist because women have to wear short skirts, and also because they don't do as much fighting as the men, and they're mainly only used for parades and other celebratory occasions. And talking of sexism, don't even think about catcalling one of these women because they might just use their army tactics on you. But coming up next, we have the Filthy 13. So these guys were part of the United States Army in World War II, and what's weird about these guys is that they were basically all criminals who committed violent crimes and were then put into prison. But the army thought they could use their violence to their strength during the war, so they let these guys leave prison to come and fight for the army. And soon after that, the group became infamous for being so good at their job. So they were allowed to do some things that other soldiers would probably get kicked out for, like having mohawks and face paint to energize the soldiers, and getting drunk and stealing cars when they were waiting for their next location. So these guys were basically the army's biggest rebels, and they have some responsibility for why we defeated the Nazis in World War II. Maybe a bit of rebellious behavior isn't so bad after all. But next up we have the Scallywags. So if you guys have ever seen the sitcom Dad's Army, which is about a group of haphazard local volunteers in the British Army during World War II, well, think of that but in real life. Because back in World War II there was actually an army unit which was made up of random people in Britain who stayed in the country to protect it from Hitler's troops coming to attack. And by day they had normal jobs like gameskeepers, handymen and dentists, but at night they had army-like alter egos. And these guys weren't technically legal because they weren't officially in the army, but they did fight Nazis, and whenever a police officer questioned their activities, the officer would be handed a piece of paper that said stop asking questions and phone this number. And when they called the number, somebody would explain what the Scallywags were doing. And of course then the police didn't mind because it actually helped. So these guys were almost like real life superheroes, but with normal life alter egos, if superheroes were old English dentists. But next up we have Ghost Army. No, this wasn't a bunch of dead guys who were in the army. This was actually a tactical deception unit used in World War II, and they were used to fool, deceive and manipulate the enemy. They were part of the US Army and were actually used a lot because of how useful they were. And the unit was made up of 1,100 soldiers. But these soldiers had no military experience. But they didn't need it, because what they did was trick the enemy by using speakers to make it sound like the army was surrounding the Nazis and scare them off. They also sent fake radio transmissions to give fake misleading directions, and they even built fake inflatable tanks to make them look more scary and put off the Nazis. And the craziest thing they did was to go into bars and pretend to be a general, and then pretend to get drunk and see if anyone kept asking them questions. And if they did, they'd know they were probably a spy. And while all of this stuff sounds kind of funny and maybe even kind of silly, it's estimated that these guys saved over 40,000 lives without firing a single bullet. But coming up next, we have the 61st Cavalry Regiment. So if I showed you this photo, chances are you'd assume it was taken ages ago. But this was actually taken in 2014 and it's of a totally modern army. The army is called the 61st Cavalry Regiment and it's located in India, and right now it's the largest and only cavalry army in the world. And cavalry armies are basically regular armies, but the soldiers fight on horseback. And a lot of people would assume that nowadays with nukes and tanks, these guys would be obsolete. But no, these guys are still used a lot in India, and the horses are trained all day, every day to become incredibly fast and very agile even in a war situation. And much like Putin's miniskirt army, they're also used in a lot of parades and celebrations. But coming up next, we have the Lovat Scouts. So the Lovat Scouts were used to fight the Boer army in South Africa back in the early 1900s. And the Boers were people who wanted to make sure black and white people were segregated in South Africa. And as you may have guessed from the Scouts part of their name, they actually employed Boy Scout members to become a part of the army group, which means some army members were actually really young kids. And in case you guys don't know, they won and managed to totally defeat the Boers of South Africa, and now black and white people are much less segregated and the land share is a lot fairer. And I guess from the Scallywags, we know that old people do well in the army, but from looking at these guys, I guess young people do as well. But next up we have A-Force. So this was an unofficial army unit set up by a British spy named Dudley Clark in World War II. And I say it's unofficial because they actually set this up illegally during the war. So imagine the Scallywags, but instead of regular people like dentists and workmen, these guys were actually unofficial British covert spies who were based all over the world to stop the Nazis back in World War II. And these guys got really famous and went down in history for something they did called Operation Treatment, which was a mission to fool the Nazis into thinking that a group of soldiers from the Middle East called El Alamein were going to arrive at a big Nazi camp 2 weeks later than they actually would, meaning the Nazis were totally unprepared and were defeated pretty easily. But coming up next we have the Jessie Scouts. So this army was around during the American Civil War between the North and South of the United States. And unlike the Lovat Scouts, the Jessie Scouts were not Boy Scouts. These guys were actually part of the Union Army, which was the North. And the weird thing that the Jessie Scouts did was go undercover. And they do this by stealing and sometimes even making Confederate Army uniforms and then wearing them while talking to Confederates to get information. So they were like the pioneers of spying. And obviously this was a huge risk, and if they were found out, they'd be killed. And unfortunately that did happen sometimes, but they didn't just dress up in Confederate uniform to get knowledge from the Confederates, because once the Jessie Scouts founder, Captain Charles Carpenter, once dressed up as a woman and then tried to seduce a Confederate officer in order to receive information. Wow, that drag act must have been really convincing. But next up we have Merrill's Marauders. So this is another army unit which is very unknown but also essential in World War II. And they had to go on one of the most dangerous missions of World War II, which was to travel across the jungle of Southeast Asia, which isn't just full of dangerous animals and plants, but also full of equally dangerous Nazi soldiers. And they sometimes had to walk for days, and many died from explosions, gunfire, and even being swallowed up by quicksand. And the weird thing about these guys is that they weren't even army members, they were just volunteers, but despite that, it's estimated that they saved over 4,000 lives. And I just wanted to put them on here because they do not get enough credit. But next up we have the Mormon Battalion. So this is a really old army that fought during the war between Mexico and the USA, and they were responsible for taking over and colonizing California, which is why today if you go to some areas of California you'll see large Mormon communities. But the thing that's weird about this army is the amount of diversity, because you could be as young as 12 to join and as old as 97, and many children did join very young as they had almost 60 kids. And they also allowed women in the army, which may sound normal today, but many years ago this would have been very uncommon. So this guy's army was more diverse than some armies today. So yeah, for better or for worse, they allowed just about anyone into their army. And that just about wraps up this video. Check out the poll in the top right corner and you guys can vote for the weirdest army. But as always, thanks for watching. Check out some more videos on screen right now. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe.